Detection, reaction, response. An idea forced upon us in a path that every single one of us has been mistakenly led down into believing that this is the answer to endpoint security, that this is the answer for preventing ransomwares and malicious attacks as a whole. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Morgan. I'm a solutions engineer at ThreatLocker, and in the next 25 minutes, I'm going to try to convince you that taking a reactive approach to endpoint security is fundamentally flawed. Now, the way I'd like to start these presentations is by sharing some information with you. Most notably, in the last 3 years, there was an estimated $2.5 billion in ransomware payouts. Now, to make the number even worse, it's also suggested that between 60 and 70% of ransomware attacks went undisclosed, because for most businesses, there's no legal requirement for them to do so. Now, to add to that, it's also suggested that there's a ransomware attack somewhere in the world every 11 seconds. Ladies and gentlemen, make no mistake about it. We are currently in a cyber war with some of the most advanced cyber criminals the world has ever seen, with more money, more resources, now in full control of what is today a multi-billion-dollar market. So what's the problem? Why is that the case? Why is it that we're constantly losing out to these guys and coming up second best? Now, throughout my presentation, you're going to notice a recurring theme. That theme is a reaction. You see, when it comes to endpoint security, we've always taken a reactive approach, so that the bad guys go first, and then we go after. But taking a reactive approach to endpoint security has never and will never work. So let's dive into it. Now, I appreciate the fact that in attendance today, we're going to have a wide range of technical mindsets, from beginner all the way to advanced and everything in between. But for this presentation to work, I want to strip all that back and have it so that no matter what your level of technical expertise is, you should be able to follow along and truly understand what it is that we're dealing with here. And to do that, we need to go back to the start. We need to talk about where all this originated from and where it started from. So we cast our minds back to the year of 2000, when a Filipino computer science student developed what was soon to be probably the first globally recognized piece of malware in the world, more commonly known as the love bug. Now, Anel de Guzman was the developer of this malware, and Anel was a talented coder. And he had messed around with malware before, but he still claims to this day that he never intended for this malware to end up going as globally widespread as it did. Now, the way Anel distributed this malware was through email, in the form of an attachment. So he embedded the malware into a text file and sent it out as an attachment, as I said. Now, for those of you that do not know what a text file is, do you know when you open the Notepad application on your computer, type in your password, save it to your desktop? That is a text file. Yes, we can see it. Please do not do that. And no, the alternative to that is not writing your password down on a sticky note and attaching it to your monitor, which, judging by the reaction, a few of you have seen as well. Unbelievable. But Anel was clever. And he tactically distributed this malware on Valentine's Day and titled the document "Love Letter to You.txt." .vbs for my techies out there. So people are lonely on Valentine's Day, they get a love letter, they open it up, right? Now, what the malware was designed to do is that it will go through the clicker's contact list, attach itself to a new email, send it to them, and then repeat the process. And within 7 jumps, this malware had spread globally around the world and ultimately ended up causing quite a bit of damage. So, my God, what a storm that guy started. So, even prior to this event, and mainly after, we move on and we start getting introduced to viruses more frequently. And what do? Well, we come out with the antivirus, right? We move on and we get new forms of malware like Trojans, rootkits, spyware. And what do? Well, we come out with next-gen antivirus, right? We started introducing AI. We fast forward to today, and we have the worst of all, ransomware. And what do? Well, we come out with what is probably the most popular tool in the market today, EDR, endpoint detection and response. So, you notice the pattern there, right? We let the bad guys go first, and then we go after. And when it comes to how these detection-based tools operate, it's no different. See, the problem with these tools is that they'll allow you to install the malicious software and then decide if it's good or bad. But if it's true in what they say, and that millions and millions of new pieces of malware are being produced every single week, I would argue, and the data will back me up here, to suggest it's impossible to know about every piece of malware out there. And if these detection tools were as good as they say they are, why is it that we Google ransomware attack, we're seeing new attacks in the news week in, week out? Because taking a reactive approach to endpoint security has never and will never work. Now, ransomwares. Let's talk about them. But before we can know what a ransomware is, we need to first of all understand how encryption works. Encryption is a term that many of you will be familiar with, some more than others. And yes, there are many different forms of encryption, but the one area we're going to focus on today is messaging encryption and how that works. Now, let's say, for example, you use an application on your phone that provides encryption services, like WhatsApp, for example. The way that works is that everybody has two keys. The first key you have is your public key. Now, every single person that you message has a copy of your public key. So when they go to send you a message, they take your public key, lock/encrypt it, and send it to you. So as the message is transferring, it's in an encrypted state. And why do we do this? Well, we do this to prevent what we call man-in-the-middle attacks. So if someone were to intercept the message and reveal the content, if you are not using encryption, they could reveal it and read the message as plain text English, which we can all read and understand. However, if you are using encryption, the message is in an encrypted state. It would take a supercomputer a very long time to crack that algorithm that they're using to encrypt the message. So again, encryption is the process of using a very advanced algorithm to transform plain text English, which we can all read and understand, into what we call ciphertext, which is completely ineligible. Now, the second key that everybody has is your private key. And you are the only person in the world that has access to that private key. So when you receive the message as locked with your public key, you then use your private key to then decrypt the message, transforming it from ciphertext back into plain text English. So, to recap, two keys, public key to encrypt, private key to decrypt after. As I said, encryption goes into a lot more detail than that. That's a very high-level explanation. So, now that we know how encryption works, let's talk about ransomwares. Ransomwares are just software. They're built using the exact same code as our everyday applications. The only difference is the intent and what they do after they execute. So they're built using the exact same code as our everyday applications like Adobe, Word, Chrome, Excel. Again, as I said, the only difference is the intent of what they do after they execute. Now, for those of you that don't know, a ransomware is a form of malicious software that when it executes, it encrypts your data and then demands a ransom payment back to release it back to you. So using our newfound knowledge, when the ransomware executes and encrypts your data, what is the only key in the world that can now decrypt the message after? And if you're thinking to yourself, the hacker's private key, you're absolutely correct. Now, in this case, we refer to it as a decryptor key. So again, we encrypt and then decrypt after. And these ransomwares are crippling businesses left, right, and center. They're absolutely rampant at the moment. There's absolutely no stopping them right now. Look, I've met with people on calls, and one of the very tough things about my job is that I'm meeting with prospects or people who work in the industry as same as ourselves, and they've experienced a ransomware attack recently. And these people, sometimes they've built companies over 20, 30 years. Someone clicked a link in an email, and either destroyed or nearly destroyed everything. Because that's all it takes. One wrong click, one wrong move, and you can get hit with a ransomware. Everybody has a target on their back. It's not a case of if you get hit with an attack. It is a case of when. Now, what I found was quite interesting, though, is to kind of sidetrack slightly here, was that after I'd done a few of these calls, one thing I always asked the people was that, what specific ransomware did you get hit with? And what I noticed is that it seemed to be the same ransomwares popping up again and again and again. So some of you will be familiar with the fact that there's kind of well-known ransomware gangs in the game. You have the likes of Conti, you got Quillen, you got Clop, you got Lockbit. Okay, very kind of common ransomware gangs that we were seeing time and time again. And as I said, it seemed to be the same guys popping up over and over again. Now, if you have a look at the Quillen ransomware from 2025, Quillen ransomware publicly recorded the most successful attacks. I think it was just shy of about 3,000 attacks. Now, ask yourself the question, out of these 3,000 businesses, what are the chances that at least 2 of them had the same endpoint security in place? What are the chances that 5 of them, 10 of them, 50, 100? Not impossible, of course, but reasonably likely. So why is it that when company A gets hit with the Quillen ransomware, okay, not good, but then you'd assume then that the detection tool in place would learn about this ransomware, add it to its definitions, share it around so that if it sees it again, it can shut it down in time. Then it gets to company B, same again, company C, D, and so on. I think this, a contributing factor to this is what we call polymorphic malware. Now, for anyone that doesn't know, polymorphic malware is a form of malware that effectively redesigns itself after every successful execution. So rewrites all the hashes, all the signatures, all the certificates, all the attack avenue, the naming convention, everything is brand new. So by the time it gets to the second company or the next company, it's a brand new ransomware that's never been seen before, which is very dangerous because now all of a sudden you're in a bit of a cat and mouse game trying to keep on top of know about all these ransomwares, which is ultimately impossible in my opinion. So, look, that's potentially one contributing factor. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, but interesting, isn't it? So, with all that being said, what do? How do we take back control and get on top of these guys again? Well, we need to go back to the drawing board, rethink the strategy, rethink the approach, because the current way isn't working. But what if there was a way in that, instead of allowing the malicious software to execute and then deciding if it's good or bad, we just blocked it by default? But not only malicious software blocking by default, what if we just blocked everything by default and assumed that everything was dangerous? Well, this is where I introduced to you ThreatLocker. You see, ThreatLocker is a zero-trust endpoint security solution. Now, at the core of what we do is application allow listing with a default deny approach. So the goal of this is to get an approved list of software and then deny everything else by default, including ransomware, malware, viruses, and so on. Now, allow listing has always been a great concept, but not necessarily a new one. But the problem with allow listing up until today was that it was a very manual process. And you had to build out the allow list application by application, hash by hash, and it just took forever. I've heard of allow listing projects using other solutions taking 2, 3, sometimes even 4 years to implement, and they're still not live. But we've changed it here at ThreatLocker, and we've automated that process for you with our learning mode. You see, when we deploy ThreatLocker, we deploy agents to your devices. When those agents first go out, they start out in what we call learning mode. Now, what learning mode is doing is it's scanning the baseline of each machine, monitoring and cataloging everything that it finds currently running in your environment already. So, anything from Windows core files, drivers, recovery files, applications. Everything's being learned and built out into permit policies for you. Kind of taking that kind of heavy movement and heavy lifting part of it away from you. And after about a 7 to 10 day period, we'll have learned about 90% of your environment. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, Morgan, that's great. You're going to learn my environment as it is in that particular week. But what happens next week when half my software decides to update? What happens then? Because it's a good point, because the legacy way of allow listing was always permit the application by hash. Now, the problem with that is hashes of applications change very frequently. So when an application gets updated, it gets blocked on the end user side until the allow listing team can extract the hashes from the update, upload it to the policy, deploy it out, which caused for a very poor end user experience as well as a frustrating admin experience. But this is where ThreatLocker separates itself from everybody else. You see, internally at ThreatLocker, we've got a 24/7 applications team that manage over 13,000 applications, which we refer to as built-ins. Now, what that means is that whenever a patch Tuesday comes along or an update gets released by those vendors, our apps team are in constant communication with them. We retrieve the new files associated with those updates, and then we catalog the policies for you, which massively reduces your overhead management of ThreatLocker. I think when I started using ThreatLocker, there was 200 built-ins. It was great then. Now there's over 13,000, meaning allow listing is getting easier and easier by the day. So between our learning mode and our built-in definitions, we've now made allow listing possible and achievable for every organization, No matter how big or small you are, we've now made it practical for everybody. Now, without going too much into detail, we go into a period where we'll basically be able to run what we call simulation denies, so we can kind of see what would have been blocked had we been in secure mode, so that way we can make policies ahead of time. Once that's done, we then go to secure mode, enforcing the allow list. So that means if anybody tries to execute or install any software as a ransomware, a virus, spyware, even trusted software that we do not have a policy for on our allow list, it'll hit your default deny policy and then prompt them to request access. Now, we don't just block executables as well. Block MSIs, PS1s, DLLs, batch files, jar files, CMD files, Python files. Same idea, no policy for it, it hits the default deny. So it's pretty simple. If there's no policy for the ransomware, it will hit that default deny every single time. Allow listing is and has to be the only way forward. It just has to be, because knowing that nothing can execute in your environment is priceless. So that's the first part. That's great. We're going to block our ransomwares by default. But some of you might be thinking, well, Morgan, what about those more advanced attacks we see nowadays? The 0 days, the fileless malware, living off the land attacks. How do we stop them? Because again, for the most part, we've been pretty unsuccessful. Now, for anybody that does not know what these kind of attacks are, let me give you an example of one. A few years ago, Apple released an update for their Mac OS. And after the update went live, somebody had reverse engineered the update and figured out that if you typed root into the username field, it would log you in as an administrator. No password required. So naturally, word gets out about this, and they had to push an immediate patch for it. So yes, another reason as to why automatic updates are never a good idea. I know what you're all thinking right now, and no, not going to say it, not happening. But it's true, though, because, again, think about it, right? As operating systems evolve, as they advance, as they develop, as we have more software available to us today than ever before, what we have to remember is that every single piece of software installed in your environment is a backdoor that hackers can leverage to gain access to your system. Because not only can all your applications talk to all the other applications, they can access your files, they can access the registry, and they can also call out to any website they want to. So think about someone clicking on a phishing link in an email, for example. Now, for any of you that work in the industry and have seen a spam filter before, I think we can all agree on the fact that, yes, occasionally you do see some pretty well-crafted phishing emails. For the most part, they're pretty ridiculous. The free iPhones, the free Amazon gift vouchers, the princes promising you millions of dollars, truly horrendous. But I think it's all safe to say we know at least someone in the office that will fall for one of those attacks. And if you're sitting there thinking, hang on a second, I don't know anyone like that. But think about it, right? When you click a phishing link in an email, typically what happens is that Outlook calls PowerShell, PowerShell calls the web browser, goes out to the hacker's web server, downloads the payload, and executes it in the environment, right? So how do we stop it? Well, this is where I introduced to you ThreatLocker's second component, application ring fencing. Now, ring fencing works hand in hand with the allow listing, and what it does is it puts controls around applications once you've allowed them to run in the environment. So the idea behind it is that we don't want applications communicating with each other. Very simple reason. No need for them to do so. In that kind of theoretical example I gave there, we would have blocked that because, again, we don't let Outlook talk to PowerShell. Don't let it talk to command prompt, curl, C-script, run DLL. Because for Office, the likes of Outlook, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, for those applications to do their day-to-day functions, they don't need to. So why would we let them? But that was a theoretical-based attack. Let's talk about a real attack that PowerShell or ring fencing would have prevented. The Microsoft Felina attack from a few years ago. The way the Felina attack worked was that a user would receive a Office file, could have been Word or Excel, with a legitimate extension at the end of it into their email. So it could be a .docx or a .xlsx. What would happen straight away is that when the user would open the file, straight away the Windows troubleshooter would launch. Now, side note, I don't know about you guys, but I have never seen that troubleshooter fix anything, like ever in my life. But from a user point of view, it could be pretty standard, right? What was actually happening in the background, though, was that Word had spawned a hidden PowerShell process that would go into the user's file explorer, take the data, send it back to the hacker server. And by the time IT had gotten around to realize it, it was too late. The damage was done. But again, ring fencing would have blocked that on multiple levels because, first of all, Word can't call PowerShell. But we also have to take into consideration these kind of quote-unquote high-risk applications as such, because we can't just outright deny them. What we do is we give these applications their own policies, but then increase restrictions. So we let PowerShell run in your environment, but we also say PowerShell can't access your files or call out to any unknown websites. Now, we're not saying don't use these applications, far from it. We learn the behavior of these applications, build the exceptions, so that there's no interruptions to your day-to-day work, and then block everything else. Most importantly for your end users, who most likely have PowerShell running on their machines right now. So this is how we control against the likes of zero-day, flawless malware, and living off the land attacks, because when malware is in your environment, it has to be able to call upon existing applications to help carry out and execute the attack. If it's going laterally across the network, trying to harvest credentials, locate where your files are to encrypt them, make that communication back to the command and control center, when everything's ring-fenced, we're effectively trapping the malware where it is, rendering it completely useless. You then pair that with our allow listing, and that's the baseline for the zero trust architecture. Allow listing is and has to be the only way forward. It really has to be. Because look, the sad reality is that every day, a high number of our colleagues that work in the industry wake up to that dreaded call of it's happened, we've been breached. And from that moment, everything changes. The fingers start getting pointed, you're now in the firing line. The next few days of your life are going to be absolute hell. So don't let these guys get ahead of you. Take back control, implement an allow listing solution today. So as I said to you, look, it's not a case of if you get hit with an attack, it's a case of when. So ask yourself the question, when these guys come knocking on your door, can you say with 100% confidence that you're ready for them? And if there's any hesitation in your answer, it's exactly why you need ThreatLocker. Because knowing that nothing can execute in your environment without your approval is priceless. And it will make you sleep better at night. Look, I think one thing I have to say is that when you solely rely on a detection-based tool, you're taking a gamble. You're gambling on the hopes that a third-party company knows about every single piece of malware that could potentially try to execute in your environment at any given stage. But remember, when you're gambling, the house always wins. Take back control, implement an allow listing today, because I promise you, you will not regret it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I am drawn towards the conclusion of my presentation. I just want to say thank you so much for your time. It's very much appreciated. I hope you've thoroughly enjoyed and potentially even learned something new here today. But before I go, I want to leave you with one thing. At the start of my presentation, I said to you all that we are currently in a cyber war with some of the most advanced cyber criminals the world has ever seen. More money, more resources, now in full control of what is today a multi-billion-dollar market. But I truly believe that with cutting-edge security solutions like ThreatLocker, that we are slowly but surely winning. Thank you.